In this series, lowimpact.org talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
I'm talking with Dill Green of Mutual Credit Services, who design models for building the commons in all sectors. Today we're talking about building a textile commons around the flax linen industry. Hello, Dill.
Hello, Dave.
So you know that I interviewed Rosie and Nick of Fantasy Fibre Mill about their work. I'll put a link to that interview and any other relevant information in the description. They're trying to revive the flax industry, the linen textile industry, and they'd like to do it as a commons. I asked them questions about the practicalities of growing flax and producing linen, and I now want to ask you some questions about how it might be developed as a commons. I want to ask questions which will be useful for them.
Okay.
And then
we did actually have a Zoom with them, so
yeah,
well as your interview, I sort of have had some direct conversations, so hopefully that will help.
Yeah, and then we can bring you together for a chat about a potential basic roadmap for building a commons for the textile industry. If that works well, we can try to do it for other industries.
Well, it's a good exercise, even if it doesn't work out. It's really good to apply these ideas to novel contexts and test them and improve them.
Yeah. So I'll just dive straight in. First question. There are lots of different parts to a potential textile commons. There's growing, there's harvesting, there's processing, spinning, weaving, distribution, retail. So what is the thing that will be commoned, i.e. what will be the common pool resource? Would it be the land for growing, the knowledge, the machinery and workshops, the shops, the finished product, or all of the above?
So you've got to really think hard about these things. You need to get it right. The one that I often think about, just because it's a relatively complex one that is documented by Eleanor Ostrom, is a fishery. So if you look there, the fishing grounds is the common pool resource in that instance. But of course, the fishing ground is also potentially a route for cargo ships, which have got nothing to do with shipping. It's possibly
fishing
includes recreational use, people swimming and yachting. It possibly includes other sorts of marine farming, as it were, maybe seagrass or things like this, which are not directly the fishing grounds. So what you see when you think about these things as commons is that there are actually overlapping commons around complex resources. And if you attempt to define a common pool resource too broadly, you'll end up with far too many stakeholders and far too diffuse a conversation and lots of perhaps cross-cutting incentives that don't relate. And that's likely to make it too difficult to get going. If, on the other hand, you define the common pool resource too narrowly, you tend to end up missing enough of the system. So if you just had fishing boats, then what about the processing, packing, immediate processing when you land the packing, maybe fish are gutted and frozen before being distributed because fish are not very durable, they haven't got a long shelf life. And there you might think, oh, we could separate the catching and the processing, but in fact, if you do that around a particular fishing ground, you're quite likely to miss some important feedback loops. So there's no simple answer. But if we look, so the land you were saying might be one thing. Well, the land could be used for growing food, or it could become a reservoir for a hydropower thing. So the land is not really part of the flax system. So there'd quite likely be a land commons.
Yeah, so exactly. So the land, whatever it's used for, could be owned by the local land commons group.
Yeah. And so a flax grower might be a tenant or a commoner. Tenant is an old word, but it's useful to think about, of a land commons. So go through you had a list of options.
Well, it's just the things that I think are probably
but it's good
so
to
growing, harvesting, processing, spinning, weaving, distribution, and retail.
Right.
And also the finished product. Would there be future use vouchers issued for bundles of yarn or square meters of linen, or even the finished clothing or sheets or things like that?
So if you think about the finished clothing in terms of the fishery, what does that mean? The fish soup in your local restaurant is going to be paid for in fishery fish vouchers.
I guess that would be
you can see that the variety, and this is a cybernetics term, not just a sort of a vague term, but the variety of end uses of linen, flax, is going to be very large. Flax has been used in industrial products, as fibers for reinforced plastics and things like that. So there's far too many uses of the finished uses to make sense to mix them up with growing, probably. So you've got to define what your system in focus is, to use another cybernetics term. My feeling is that yarn is possibly quite a good one. So that's a certain distance along the processing chain. Yeah. So what we've united is growers, initial processors, and secondary processors, so harvesters and cleaners. And I'm probably misrepresenting the flax process, but there's several stages of machinery before you get to yarn.
Yeah.
And I think, and then you've got an issue with yarn because there might be many different standards of yarn. But as we do in the housing commons, possibly you could do a weight, a physical quantity of yarn times some sort of quality or value multiplier, or
yeah. So for houses, you mean things like parking spaces, the view, the neighborhood, the quality of the house itself, and this you would apply that to flax yarn as well. The how various aspects of the quality of that yarn.
That's my sort of guess, because then you've got a very clear unit, which is a kilogram times a quality multiplier of something of a relatively short, it's a short enough or a tight enough set of processors or workers or processes that I think they've all got something to talk to each other about. The processors will have something to say to the growers about, well, if you could grow this variety, or you're watering it too much, or you're harvesting too early or something. But the processors could say, well, actually, can you use this lower grade stuff because I'm still improving this land for flax, or I'm having to use these seeds. What can we weave out of that? What we can spin out of that will have a market. And so that seems like a place where there's useful conversation to be had. Whereas people who design and specify clothing are probably more interested in talking to the weavers. And the weavers then figure out what yarn they need to achieve a certain quality of cloth. And so then you might have sort of weavers, designers, fabricators in a commons around cloth. And that might include not just linen cloth, perhaps, because, you know, when you make a garment, you might make it 90% of linen, but there might be a lining that's made of silk or something, you know, or cotton. So, and it needs buttons and all sorts of things that are nothing to do with the flax manufacturing. So my feeling is that yarn is probably an interesting place to start, but the process of that thinking is more important than whether I've got the answer right.
Okay. I mean, textiles, it's a higher risk than, for example, energy, isn't it? You can have a good idea how much electricity a wind turbine or solar panels will produce, but not their flax processing machinery yet. How do we deal with that risk?
I'm not so sure that the machinery is the risk. I mean, they seem pretty super smart and using, you know, very modern technology to enable small machines to be productive enough. It's more the problem with all agriculture. What if it rains too much this year?
Yeah.
What if there's a drought?
Yeah. So
that's the risk element. And yeah,
all the different factors, they don't know how efficiently and how much yarn they can produce and how good it's going to be, and because of all sorts of factors.
well, that's another reason I think for having a commons around the yarn as the unit of account in a way, because that enables farmers to communicate early to, you know, processors and spinners and refiners that this is a wet year. You know, my crop was washed out. I had to plant again late. The quality of the yarn that's likely to come out from this, or the quality of the seed or the fibers that is likely to come out with this, are going to be a bit more like that. You know, can we, you know, get ourselves ready for that? Can we communicate to our customers that, you know, this is a year where we're going to produce a lot of low grade, you know, sackcloth stuff, you know. I don't know. I'm obviously making things up. I don't know enough about flax, but that level of integration where, you know, okay, maybe the spinners of yarn, you know, can adapt the machine to do another job. You know, I don't know. Maybe they can't. It's specific for flax, or maybe they can buy, you know in advance they've got to buy some material in from France to augment the local produce and plan together accordingly. You know, the other thing about a commons is, you know, in one year maybe the producers, the spinners, have had a bumper year because linen got very fashionable, and the next year there's a drought or something, but the producers, if they're all part of the commons with the farmers, will have good reason to support the farmers to get through that. So yeah, I mean, the risk is essentially offset by bringing a few more stakeholders in. If you've got entirely separate farmers, entirely separate processors, and entirely separate spinners, then if the farmers could see bad weather coming, they can just decide to grow potatoes instead without reference to the processors or the spinners, and that just destroys their lives. So having them in conversation immediately reduces the risk.
Yeah. You've mentioned something before when we were talking about other sectors, that there could be agreements to buy vouchers for finished goods, in this case yarn, further down the line when they've had some success, and so there's less risk. And the earlier investors get in, the bigger the discount they get. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, this is essentially, if we try and build the commons without money, it'll take forever. Because there's a lot of novel work to be done, which means everything's more expensive than it would otherwise be. And this is a problem co-ops have. They have to do a lot of extra things that an ordinary business doesn't have to do. So they also try and pay better wages or reduce rents. So they're at a disadvantage compared to the rest of the market. So we can't really build the commons with no money. So then if we're going to get money, there are basically borrowing, selling shares to investors, or getting philanthropic money. That's the options that people are presented with at the moment. And none of those is really easy to fold into the mix of commons, although we're trying to make as many routes in for money as possible. But in principle, you don't want debt because you're feeding the system that is about extraordinary high level of property rights. You stop paying the debt and your commons is deleted. They just repossess everything. Mm-hmm. If you've got shareholders, that's a extraction forever route.
Yep.
So they're taking a share of profits out all the time that have got nothing to do, that don't go back into the common pool resource. And that's the point of the commons, is you want to continually steward your common pool resource so it becomes more productive for everybody. And philanthropic money, the problem with that is, where does it come from? Usually comes from someone having done something that is degrading the biosphere, attacking the commons, because that's what private businesses mostly do, whether they intend to or not, and then taking a small amount of the money they earn that and using it to salve their guilt or make them feel better. And you can see that 2 steps backward, 1 step forward takes us backwards over time, not forward. So philanthropic money is useful as a Kickstarter, but you actually need a machine, and this is the point of commons. We need a machine that takes the assets of the old economy, abstract dollars, pounds, in digital numbers, turns them into us controlling assets, but we repay returns to investors, because they'll need them, they'll require them, otherwise they won't give us the money, in the value that we produce, not in pounds or dollars. So this is what a future use voucher is.
Yeah.
So if you're wanting to, let's say, ramp up production of these new clever machines that the people in the Commoning Flax group are building, there's significant amounts of money involved in the R&D, and then significant amounts of money in building copies of those machines and distributing them. If investors in those were willing to buy future yarn kilograms, tokens, and at a discount now, so say a kilogram of yarn goes for 100 quid, maybe they pay 80 quid now, and then later on when yarn is produced, they can buy that yarn with the voucher. They wouldn't do this directly themselves, they'd probably do it through some sort of platform, but they can basically redeem that voucher and then get the 100 quid that the kilogram of yarn is sold for. So they've got a 25% return on their capital. That sounds like a lot, but it depends how many years it takes. If it takes 5 years to get that 25% return, they've got a sort of 5% annual rate of return, which is roughly what pensions like to do. So you can see there that if you want to help the Flax Commons, the Linen Commons, you want to invest, but you can't afford to give the money away, you can put pounds in, eventually get flax tokens out, and yes, you can turn those into pounds later, but actually, if a commons economy develops, you might be able to swap those vouchers for other services without needing pounds at all. And every pound we don't need is an infinite stream of debt that we're not, of interest that we're not paying into the banking system.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else you want to say about bringing investment into the budding textile commons?
So the key thing to think about is investors are generally, especially if you're not paying mega returns and you're not going to turn into Amazon, they're generally pretty risk averse. So what you need to have is a very solid story about the future persistence, continuity of what they're investing in. We've got these growers, we've got these machines, we've got these processors, we've got these spinners, we've got these buyers. This is this, which is effectively what you have to do for any investment prospectus. So you have to convince people to a sufficient degree that they will get roughly the returns that they expect within the limits of their tolerance of risk. And because a commons is a relatively novel institution, people need possibly extra confidence. And so this brings us to governance, and the commons governance has to be very clearly robust and resilient to shocks. And in essence, the best way to prove that is just to have more and more commons, and you can just point at them and say, well, look, they're very resilient and robust. At the moment, starting out, we tend to be, having to tell very, very good stories to relatively willing investors already who want it to be true. We're not having to convince people who think it's communism, that it's not or anything. We've got people who love the commons, but still need reassurance that their money's not going to disappear and then they're going to have a miserable old age.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? We don't have those things to point at up and running, especially in the flax industry.
No, it's called pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Yeah.
And it's obviously a known problem. All novel structures have to do this, and generally what happens is a relatively small number of people who believe in something get together and do it, and if it works, people get excited about it. What encourages me a lot is I think there's enormous latent desire for the sort of good news stories that commons would bring.
Yeah.
Because quite small and limited projects that have almost no real impact are very well known. People really like to hear about Cooperation Jackson or the Preston model or Mondragon or regenerative agriculture projects, even though if you look at those in comparison to the systems that they're an alternative to, they just don't exist statistically. And Mondragon is a negligible fraction of Spain's industrial production. They're a great thing that people look at, but it's just a truck company and a few associated metal bashing companies, and they make trucks. They're not. But people really, really love these stories, and so they get shared a lot around people who want hope. If we can stand up some better stories than those, then, and if we make the model easier to replicate because it's got this return on investment story, which co-ops don't have. Co-ops not generally seen as being a place where investors go and set co-ops up.
Yeah, I mean, it's in Stroud, everybody we talk to about the commons just loves the idea. That's everybody. And then, fewer people start to talk with us and get more involved. And there's quite a small group who are actually rolling their sleeves up and getting stuck in and building it. But
Yeah,
if we can get things rolling, and if we can get things, as you say, that we can point at and say, look, that works, then it's going to be a lot less difficult to inspire
yeah.
potential investors and customers
And
and
that's why we're
workers.
building the housing commons, and we've got a house. We've got the first tenant moving in a week, I think.
Yeah,
And I think even just one house that has been bought without debt and has tenants able to pay 5% less than market rent, and
it's a great story.
investors
Yeah.
who are getting a return, that will be remarkable. And if we can build on that this year and get another house by the end of the year, then we're on the way.
Yeah,
Um,
and then double the number of houses every year.
that would be a good target. Yeah, yeah.
Can I just back to the textile commons? Could you? I know that you're a fan of secondary institutions. I know
Mm.
you think they're important for developing a sector, like secondary housing co-ops. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah. All over the place, everywhere, because people, again, because of this latent desire for better, people build incredible projects. Not all commons, just people are any town or city you go to, there are lots and lots of people pouring their heart and soul into socially optimistic projects. And most of those projects, I'd say all of them, are rowing upstream. They're going against the grain of what the finance system wants. The finance system doesn't like community, not in any sort of ideological way. The finance system is a machine. It doesn't like community because communities resist the flow of capital. They say things like, don't mow down that woods and build a housing estate. That's where I played when I was a kid and where my kids play. Don't do it. And community resistance is what stopped a third runway at Heathrow, and maybe it will do so again. There's another huge fight brewing. So the finance system doesn't like community. It likes a lot of atomized, insecure individuals who put most of their energy into looking after themselves. Even though that's true, though, there are these people who set up brilliant projects all over the place, and usually on the back of a few people who massively overcommit. They're doing a job and running some community project or campaigning for something. Those people, because they're rowing upstream,
Upstream, yeah.
are normally totally consumed by the local effort. They've got no time to look up and around them, or very, very little time to look up and around them. And so the learning, the knowledge, the expertise, the culture that is built up in each project is almost completely inside that project. And if you go and try and talk to community projects, you discover this very quickly. They're sort of friendly because they're nice people. But if you start to talk to them about something that isn't directly what they're doing, they say, that sounds amazing, but actually what we're doing here is enough. We can't even think about that, sorry. And if you try and say, but it will help you better, they'll say, I haven't got time to do better. I've just got to do good enough. And they're entirely right. So without there being some way of funding places where people who gain expertise, capacity, cultural knowledge, wisdom, whatever, from running projects can earn a living by helping other projects.
Yeah.
All of this incredible value, social value, education, knowledge value, whatever, is gone when the project collapses. And most of these good projects collapse or go the other way and turn into bureaucratic institutions if they're really successful. And
Or get bought.
because the overcommitters usually burn out. I've seen some really great people working in really great projects, and the project, for one reason or another, doesn't survive, and they retreat back into something safer. And who can blame them?
Mm-hmm.
Or you have someone who's a success, and then they say, right, this is the project, and they are still siloed because they're trying to make it into some big organization, giant charity or something.
So
The secondary movement needs to be that a way has to be found for that to become real, and that will be the way that learning from projects can be shared, and it becomes much easier to set up new projects based on the learning of existing projects.
yeah, so in Stroud, as you know, we're looking to build a commons lab, like a center of excellence to, amongst other things, research commons models and test what works. Do you think a textile commons will need something like that? And in fact, all sectors might need something like that.
Yeah, I mean, all these sorts of things already exist in the system as we have. Every county has got some equivalent of a tourist board where they try and collect together understanding about what it takes to get tourist pounds into their county. It's not anything weird that we're thinking about. There'll be an industry body for people who grow. There'll be a wool association. There'll be a leather association. All these things that people always produce these things. So fostering one for the commons movement is not a weird idea. It's just something that needs itself to be a commons. So it needs to be constituted as a commons. Otherwise, it becomes a cost overhead. There are quite a lot of industry associations which don't really do much, and people just join them hoping that they will lobby government or that sort of thing. Or there are other institutions like the Federation of Small Builders, which are actually not really a federation at all, but a money-making project where people put the Federation of Small Builders logo on the side of the van, and and customers think, oh, that can't be a cowboy. They're a member of Federation of Small Businesses. Having considered joining the Federation of Small Businesses, I discovered they do no vetting at all. They just take your money and then you can have the logo to put it on your van. That's all they are, is a marketing exercise. So this has, if there's a secondary commons organization, it needs to be set up in a commons friendly way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, they've got to make enough money to survive in the modern world. Could the growth of the commons in other sectors help with that? For example, if the housing commons grows to provide affordable rents and no worries about eviction, could that help them survive? And the same with other sectors.
In the end, building a commons economy is the only way that it will deliver systems change. In the end, what the way it turns into an economy is when people have bought rent vouchers and flax vouchers and kilowatt hour vouchers, that they begin to be able to swap those for other things and not need pounds.
Yeah.
Which means they don't have to go to work as often for the system. They need fewer pounds.
That's a good strap line. You don't have to work so much.
Yeah. And they've got more agency, they've got more choice about what they will do with their lives, and so they might start to build commons or protest against runways more or whatever it is, things that will decrease bad stuff happening. And most crucially, it will reduce the amount of interest that is paid into the banking system. The banking system seems utterly huge and utterly indomitable, but the fact is, interest is only ever a fraction of the money in play. So quite a small amount of reduction in the amount of interest paid is quite a big reduction in the extractive profits of the finance sector.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're paying, 1% less in interest, they might be getting 10% less profit.
Right.
Because
And
for
I
every,
guess
say you borrow £100 and they charge you 5% interest, yeah. Their profit is £5. If you only need to borrow £80 and therefore only pay £4 interest, their profit is 4, not 5. They've had a 20% drop in profits.
yeah.
So a 20% drop in profits for a capitalist organization is going to make their shareholders jump up and down and scream.
Yeah. So if there's no returns to capitalist shareholders, no interest to be paid on.
Well, that's an exaggeration. It's not no returns. The thing is, what they're all. If you look at
No, I mean in the
financial
capitalist
charts,
shareholder model.
yeah. If you look at financial charts, trying to find absolute numbers, how many millions, how many billions, they're hard to find. Most financial charts are a percentage difference from what it was last year.
Mm-hmm.
They really notice if something drops by 20%, it doesn't have to be zero profits. It's just if profits from a bank go down by 20%, everybody runs around like crazy. So it's sort of it's not requiring all interest to be deleted from the economy before the commons economy starts to have an impact. Even quite small reductions in the amount of interest ordinary people pay is quite big reductions in the profits of the banks.
Yeah, and it also means that more money stays in communities, so there's therefore more opportunity to
More of
generate
people's time.
local customers, and there's more opportunities to make an
Yeah.
income.
But it's almost more of people's productive time stays in communities. That's the thing is, if people will work for, rent vouchers and flax vouchers and kilowatt hour vouchers and, water vouchers,
Care vouchers.
then
Mm.
it's not that the money stays, it's just they need less money.
Yeah.
And that they can more and more do what most people, again, would like to do, which is to work for something which they can see is improving the quality of life where they are, without them themselves suffering, massive poverty or, worries about feeding their children or anything like that. It has to not degrade their material conditions of life unduly. If they can do that and increase the general quality of life in their local environment, they will vote for that, because a general quality of life in your local environment actually improves your material conditions of existence. So you get a win-win at that point. If you're working without having less access to food, shelter, warmth, care, for something that's improving local conditions, well, that's generally going to mean there's less need for care in that area, because more people are adequately housed, less people are being mentally damaged by working in appalling jobs, being in extreme poverty. So actually, the standard people will, over time, be able possibly even to accept a materially reduced standard of living, because the socially delivered quality of life will be so rewarding. And honestly, that's where we're going to end up one way or another as the biosphere degrades. We are going to have a materially impacted standard of living. It's just going to be less possible to eat strawberries in February because they don't grow in this country. So, but all sorts of other things that are less obvious than that will also be harder to access. So the commons is needed because places where people have got good social solidarity and lower material conditions of existence are happier. Every year, some country in Africa turns out to be the happiest place on the planet. And everyone scratches their head. Hang on, all the pictures I see of Africa are disease, drought, malnutrition, civil war. How can these people be happy?
Community is an essential for human well-being, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And in this country, we've got possibly the most degraded community conditions of anywhere on the planet.
Yeah.
Really quite devastated, really, through having been capitalist longer than anyone else.
Listen, I've got a couple more questions. You know about the Open Food Network, which provides a platform for smallholders to sell their food.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't have a website, maybe they're not interested in having a website, so they provide a platform for smallholders. Maybe there could be something like an open textile network to do the same thing, to help with marketing in the textile world.
There absolutely could be, yeah. That would require enough sort of flax commons like initiatives.
Yeah, it would have to go.
To make it worth doing that. There is a real problem to overcome in the food thing, because we've talked to the Open Food Network about introducing something like a food box voucher, but the problem there is a kilo of flax yarn is a pretty well understood thing, and with the addition, as we discussed, of some quality multipliers, you can probably have a kilo of rough stuff that's suitable for making string, and a kilo of superfine stuff that's capable of being made into a dress shirt, or a pillowcase or something like that. And there might be a ×10 multiplier, but it's still flax. The relationship to the whole growing, producing, spinning supply chain is still roughly the same, so a lot of conditions won't vary. But a food box, so even though from a local organic veg box scheme, the prices seem to have sort of become pretty stable. It's sort of 15 to 20 quid for your standard weekly box. So that could become a unit, but how do you price, a sack of potatoes against that unit? It's much food again. The variety, it's this level of variety that makes that harder to imagine. So food is a tough nut to crack. I mean, community-supported agriculture schemes, as far as I can see, mostly are a very small percentage of the participating families' food needs. And so they're participating as a social thing, because they're a group of people who've come together usually around one or two farms, and usually in the same area. So if it's a really drought year, then all of them get less food. There's no resilience in there. So for people used to being able to go to the supermarket and just buy whatever they need when they need it, there's quite a long road, I think, to being able to have a commons around food production. I think commoning the land, commoning the machinery, the purchasing of seeds, and maybe the processing of food, all of those seem independently commons, but it's a difficult one. Food. Flax is much simpler.
Right.
Like housing, it's got this nice, it's like, fisheries, you can say kilos of fish. Yeah, sardines are not as valuable as halibut, but they're not completely different. you just pack them in ice in boxes, and sardines are a tenth the price of halibut. But it's all collected by fishing. It's all delivered to people who want to buy fish.
And of course, if things start to fall over, if things start to get worse, if we have networks of local commons businesses with people who can grow things, process things, fix machinery, etc., it's going to be a lot more secure for people in those kinds of communities.
That's sort of, so whenever we think, are we doing the right thing given the accelerating pace of the Omni crisis, where it seems like we're already through the 1.5 degrees, maybe 1.6 degrees already, that notions of transforming the finance system seem a bit of a joke, in that there's no way that that's going to happen
In time.
in a short
Yeah.
period of time, and it may well be that the impact of climate change is far too quick for us to do anything meaningful. But if we're building this community resilience through a cultural model of how to collaborate around our needs without becoming a collective, without becoming a sort of communist club, we might well have something which people can adopt when things look dicey. In the same way, at the beginning of COVID, a few people knew how to do mutual aid networks because they'd been running them themselves as activists or as campaigners or as commune type people. There were people who'd figured out ways of mobilizing and connecting people so that they could support each other without them necessarily agreeing on everything or being part of the same organization. And because those were available, the models and the ideas about how to do it, within a couple of months of lockdown, there were tens of thousands of mutual aid networks just in the UK, and they were worldwide. People in New Zealand it became a sort of movement in New Zealand, and there were sort of national groups of mutual aid networks who were building their own software and things like this. Really, so something which had been a very niche, very definitely not a mainstream idea. Most people in the street had never heard of mutual aid networks before COVID. And now, all the middle class people in my street are in a WhatsApp group called the Mutual Aid Network, even though they're gentrifiers and they're using it as a neighborhood watch. So just having a story as to how people could club together and manage a local water system effectively for themselves, or a local transport system, or whatever it is, might be incredibly valuable if local government goes bust, which is happening all the time in the UK. They're not allowed to actually disappear when they go bust, but the biggest single city outside of London, the council's gone bust. It's now being run by the government because its finances just didn't work. And what the government is doing is withdrawing almost all non-statutory services. So, if you live in Birmingham, the quality of civil life is degrading rapidly. And so when things like that happen, if the commons model is well understood, and there are particularly these secondary organizations who can help set new ones up and bring best practice and wisdom as to how to deal with the problems or how to adapt the models to specific contexts, if they're around, then we might find rapid uptake. So it's as much providing exemplars and
Yeah.
packaging up wisdom, knowledge, tools, skills, being willing to connect people together. All of those things is valuable, even if the finance stuff doesn't have time to change the world.
Okay, Dill. I'll get this interview written up. I'll get it on YouTube. I'll send it to Rosie and Nick, and then we can get you all together for another interview, and you can ask each other relevant questions, and we can see if we can take it a step further.
That would be amazing. Yeah. Given that and listen to this.
If you like our channel, please consider liking this video and subscribing. The more people like our videos and subscribe to our channel, the more the YouTube algorithm will share them. It doesn't cost anything, so please press the like and subscribe buttons. And if you click the bell icon just underneath as well, you'll get a notification when we upload a new video. Thank you.